The Gospel accounts suggest that it often began before sunrise. As the first lit spread across Galilee, those scenes were connected by roads. Long roads, dusty roads. Even after demanding days of travel and responsibility, Jesus continued to seek moments of solitude.
Most people know the famous moments of Jesus' life, the miracles, the crowds, the sermons that have been talked about for nearly 2,000 years. But those moments were only a small part of his story. A day is a long time, a week is even longer. And for nearly 3 years, Jesus travelled across Galilee and Judea almost constantly. He walked dusty roads, shared simple meals, slept wherever shelter could be found, taught in villages, spoke with strangers, and lived within the same physical realities as everyone around him. So what did that life actually look like? What time did his day begin? How far did he walk? Where did he sleep? When did he eat? Did he ever have a moment of privacy? And what happened during all the hours that the Gospels only mention in passing? These are questions most people never stop to ask, yet they reveal one of the most fascinating parts of the story. Because when we strip away centuries of paintings, traditions, and assumptions, we discover something unexpected. The life of Jesus was not lived only in miracles and dramatic public moments. Most of it unfolded in the ordinary rhythm of daily life, on the road, among crowds, inside small villages, and under the open sky of first-century Judea. In this documentary, we're going to reconstruct a typical day in the life of Jesus, from the quiet hours before sunrise to the moment he finally stopped to rest at night. Using the Gospel accounts, historical evidence, and what we know about everyday life in the ancient world, we'll follow the practical reality of his routine step by step. And by the end, you may discover that the most demanding part of Jesus' ministry wasn't a miracle, a sermon, or a confrontation with his enemies. It was simply living that life every single day. To understand what Jesus did each day, we first need to understand the world he woke up in every morning. Most of the villages where Jesus spent his time were small communities clustered around the Sea of Galilee. Places like Capernaum, Bethsaida, and Magdala were not large cities filled with wide streets and public buildings. They were small working communities where nearly everyone knew one another. The houses were simple, often built from local stone. Families lived close together. Neighbours shared courtyards, wells, and daily routines. Privacy was rare. The moment someone stepped outside, they became part of village life, and that mattered. Because once Jesus became known, moving unnoticed was almost impossible. A short walk through a village could quickly turn into a conversation, a request for help, a question from a curious neighbour, or a crowd gathering around him before the day had barely begun. Beyond the villages stretched a landscape that could be both beautiful and demanding. Dusty paths connected one settlement to another. In some areas, the terrain was gentle and green. In others, especially farther south toward Judea, travellers faced rocky hills, dry valleys, and long stretches of difficult ground. There were no buses, no carts waiting on every corner. Most journeys happened on foot. A walk that takes a few minutes by car today could require hours in the first century, and Jesus was almost always walking. But that raises an interesting question. After spending hours on the road, where did he actually sleep at night? The Gospels often mention him arriving in a town, leaving a town, or travelling between regions. It's easy to read past those details, but every journey meant time, effort, heat, dust, and often a growing crowd following behind him. Even the places where he taught were shaped by the realities of the landscape. Most synagogues were relatively small, which helps explain a detail many readers overlook in the Gospels. When too many people gathered, teaching moved outdoors. A hillside could become a meeting place, a shoreline could become an audience hall. On some occasions, Jesus even taught from a fishing boat just offshore while people listened from the land. It's a fascinating detail because it reminds us that much of his ministry happened under the open sky, not inside grand buildings, not surrounded by comfort, but out in the middle of everyday life. And once we understand that setting, another question naturally follows. Who are the people sharing that world with him every day? Once we understand the world Jesus moved through each day, another question naturally comes up. Who was actually travelling with him? The popular image often focuses on Jesus alone, walking from village to village. But the historical accounts paint a different picture. Most of the time, he was surrounded by people. His ministry was not a solitary journey. It was a travelling community made up of disciples, supporters, hosts, and countless individuals who crossed paths with the group along the way. At the centre were the 12 disciples, men from different backgrounds who brought a variety of skills and experiences to the group. Some had worked as fishermen on the Sea of Galilee, while others came from occupations such as tax collection and other trades common throughout the region. Together, they helped sustain the daily demands of a life on the road. Life on the road involved constant practical decisions. Food, water, lodging, and safe travel all depended on cooperation and the relationships the group built with local communities. Here's a detail that surprises many people. The ministry was supported by a wider network beyond the 12 disciples. Luke specifically mentions women such as Joanna, Susanna, and others who helped provide financial support from their own resources. This detail offers an important glimpse into how the group sustained itself. Travelling through Galilee and Judea required money for food, supplies, and other daily needs, and the ministry appears to have relied on the generosity of those who believed in its mission. Here's another detail that rarely gets attention. The group maintained a common money bag carried by Judas Iscariot. That small detail tells us something important. This wasn't a loose collection of followers. It was a travelling community dealing with real expenses every day. At the same time, every village brought new social challenges. Roman authority was a constant presence throughout the region, and local religious customs shaped everyday life. The group had to navigate questions of hospitality, local expectations, Sabbath observance, and the sometimes complicated relationship between ordinary people and those who held power. Entering a new town was not simply a matter of arriving. Trust had to be established. Relationships had to be built. People had to decide whether they would welcome these travellers or view them with suspicion. When we put all of these pieces together, a clearer picture begins to emerge. Jesus was not simply moving through a landscape. He was leading a constantly shifting community of people, each bringing their own needs, strengths, questions, and responsibilities. And that reality makes the next part of the story even more remarkable. But organising the group was only part of the challenge. What happened once the day actually began was even more demanding. Because organising the group was one thing. Surviving a normal day was something else entirely. So what did a normal day in the life of Jesus actually look like? The Gospel accounts suggest that it often began before sunrise. While most of the villagers around him were still quiet, Jesus would sometimes leave the place where he and the disciples were staying and seek out a solitary place to pray. These early hours may have been among the few moments of complete silence he experienced during the day. Before the crowds arrived, before the questions began, and before the demands of ministry filled every hour, there was a brief period of stillness. But that stillness rarely lasted long. As the first light spread across Galilee, daily life began to awaken. Fishermen returned from the water, farmers headed toward their fields, merchants prepared for another day of business. News travelled quickly in small communities, and once people learned that Jesus was nearby, the day could change almost instantly. Some arrived hoping to hear him teach, others came searching for healing. Many brought personal burdens, family concerns, illnesses, or questions that had troubled them for years. In a world without hospitals, counsellors, or social support systems as we know them today, people often carried their struggles directly to the individuals they trusted most. And that is where the pace of Jesus' daily life becomes easier to understand. The crowds described in the Gospels were not occasional events. They became a regular part of Jesus' daily routine. Again and again, people gathered wherever he went, sometimes in numbers so large that movement became difficult. One account describes a crowd so dense that a group of men carrying a paralysed friend could not even reach him through the doorway. Instead, they climbed onto the roof, opened it above him, and lowered the man down into the room. Think about what that scene must have looked like. The crowd wasn't standing politely at a distance. People were packed so tightly that the only way to reach Jesus was through the roof itself. And that detail reveals something important about daily life around him. Wherever he went, people were waiting, searching for answers, healing, or hope. The Gospel of Mark records another revealing moment. The crowds became so constant that Jesus and the disciples struggled to find time even to eat. Think about that for a moment. Most of us can postpone a meeting or delay an errand. It's much harder to postpone a meal. Yet even simple moments of rest were often interrupted by the needs of the people around him. As the hours passed, teaching became only one part of the routine. There were conversations with individuals, questions from religious leaders, requests from followers, and constant interaction with people from every level of society. Fishermen, labourers, merchants, parents, widows, tax collectors, travellers, and local officials all moved through the same crowds, bringing different concerns and different expectations. And then there was the travel. Many people imagine the ministry of Jesus as a series of famous scenes connected together in the pages of the Gospels. In reality, those scenes were connected by roads, long roads, dusty roads that had to be walked one step at a time under the sun, across uneven ground, through villages, along shorelines, and over hills that stretched across the landscape of Galilee and Judea. The afternoon heat settled over the roads, and every step kicked up more dust from the ground. The next destination had to be reached. Yet wherever Jesus arrived, another group of people was often waiting, and perhaps that is the detail many modern readers overlook. The miracles were extraordinary. The teachings were unforgettable. But the thing that filled most of his days was people. People asking, people searching, people following, people hoping. Day after day, this cycle repeated itself with very little privacy and very little opportunity to step away from the needs of others. When we look closely at the historical setting and the gospel accounts, one conclusion becomes difficult to avoid. Maintaining this pace for months and years required extraordinary endurance, not only physically, but emotionally as well. And that raises another question. What was the true cost of living this way every single day? When we look at the daily routine of Jesus, it's easy to focus on the visible parts of the story, the teachings, the journeys, the crowds, and the events that became famous. What often goes unnoticed is the personal cost of sustaining that routine month after month and year after year. Life in the first century was physically demanding for almost everyone. Travel required constant effort, food and water could never be taken for granted, and even basic necessities depended heavily on local conditions and the generosity of others. For Jesus and the disciples, there was no permanent home serving as a base of operations and no predictable schedule. Every new destination brought uncertainty. A village that welcomed them one day might reject them the next, and a journey that seemed straightforward could quickly become more difficult than expected. But food, water, and travel were only part of the story. In many ways, the emotional burden may have been even harder to carry. Day after day, people approached Jesus with problems they could not solve on their own. Illness, grief, fear, uncertainty, and desperation followed him wherever he went. Many arrived looking for answers. Others were searching for hope. Some simply wanted someone willing to listen. Living under that kind of constant expectation would have been exhausting for anyone. And even when the crowds were gone, the responsibility remained. The disciples required continual guidance, correction, and encouragement. The Gospels frequently show them struggling to understand what Jesus was teaching, asking questions, debating among themselves, and looking to him for direction. Leadership demanded patience, and there was rarely an opportunity to step away from that responsibility. At the same time, opposition was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Religious leaders monitored his actions, questioned his teachings, and looked for reasons to challenge his growing influence. Public appearances often carried an underlying tension that most ordinary travellers never had to face. Taken together, these realities reveal a side of Jesus' life that is easy to overlook. Beyond the miracles and public teachings was a daily existence shaped by responsibility, pressure, uncertainty, and endurance. The ministry was sustained not only through extraordinary moments, but through countless ordinary days that demanded physical energy, emotional resilience, and an unwavering commitment to continue despite the weight of it all. And as each day finally came to an end, one question remained. Where did Jesus and his followers go when the crowds finally dispersed? As the day drew to a close, another challenge began. In the first century, darkness changed everything. Once the sun disappeared beyond the hills, travel became far more difficult and daily activity slowed dramatically. Without modern lighting, most people organised their lives around the natural rhythm of daylight. For Jesus and the disciples, that meant finding a place to spend the night before darkness settled across the countryside. Sometimes that place was a village. The ancient tradition of hospitality played an important role throughout the region, and the Gospels contain several examples of Jesus and his followers staying with people who welcomed them into their homes. In those moments, the pace of the day finally began to slow. Meals were shared, conversations continued. The disciples often used these quieter hours to ask questions they had not raised in public and to gain a deeper understanding of Jesus' teachings. Many of the explanations recorded in the Gospels may have taken place during these private conversations, away from the crowds and interruptions of the day. Not every evening, however, ended inside a home. There were times when the group found themselves far from a village or travelling through areas where hospitality could not be guaranteed. In those situations, there were certainly occasions when the group may have spent the night outdoors, resting in open areas, among olive groves, or on the hillsides that surrounded much of the region. Conditions were simple, comfort was limited. The ground itself often became the bed after another long day on the road. For modern readers, this can be difficult to imagine. After hours of walking, teaching, listening, and interacting with crowds, there was no hotel waiting at the end of the journey, no comfortable room, no guarantee of privacy. Life remained closely connected to the rhythms of the natural world, and every evening brought the same uncertainty about where the next night might be spent. One detail appears repeatedly throughout the Gospels. Even after demanding days of travel and responsibility, Jesus continued to seek moments of solitude, often ending the day in prayer just as he had begun it. While others rested, he sometimes withdrew to a hillside, a garden, or another secluded place away from the activity of the camp. And perhaps that detail tells us more about his daily life than anything else. After the crowds, the conversations, the journeys, and the endless demands of the day, he continually returned to silence. And when we step back and look at the complete picture, a remarkable pattern emerges. The life of Jesus was not made up entirely of miracles and dramatic public moments. Most of it was spent walking dusty roads, sharing simple meals, listening to ordinary people, teaching small groups, and moving from one day to the next within the realities of first-century life. And perhaps that is what makes this story so compelling. Behind every famous event recorded in the Gospels was a real day, lived one step at a time, in a world that demanded endurance, patience, and unwavering purpose. By now, the answer to our original question is much clearer. The life of Jesus was not defined only by miracles and sermons, but by the countless ordinary hours that surrounded them. If you've ever felt overwhelmed trying to understand how all the kings, prophets, empires, and major events of the Bible fit together, you're certainly not alone. For many people, the biggest challenge isn't reading scripture, it's understanding where everything belongs in the larger story. That's why we created the ebook the Bible in chronological order. This visual guide helps organize the entire biblical timeline from Genesis to Revelation, allowing you to clearly see how the major events, prophets, kings, and kingdoms connect together. And when you get your copy, you're also helping support the continued production of documentaries like this one. The official link is waiting for you in the first pinned comment below. As we close, perhaps the most surprising discovery is that the life of Jesus was not defined only by extraordinary moments. It was also shaped by ordinary ones. The conversations no one recorded, the meals shared with friends, the long walks between villages, the quiet hours of prayer before another demanding day began. Those moments rarely receive the same attention as the miracles, yet they reveal something essential about the man at the centre of the story. They show a life marked by purpose, endurance, compassion, and a constant commitment to the people around him. And perhaps that is why these ancient accounts continue to resonate after nearly 2,000 years. Because behind the history, behind the crowds, and behind the famous events, we find something deeply human, a life lived one day at a time.